In the early 19th century, Britain was the most powerful nation on earth. Her colonies stretched from the Caribbean to the South Pacific. This was the largest empire the world had ever seen. But there is a lost chapter to that imperial history, the story of over 1 million people who were secretly enslaved and transported to the farthest shores of the British Empire. Shipped under agreements that they could neither read nor understand, they didn't know where they were going, and most of them never made it home. Yet what was one of the largest movements of people in the 19th century has now been almost completely forgotten. It is a story of greed, injustice, and the abuse of power. A story which implicates those at the very highest level of successive British governments.
Indentured emigration is one of the most remarkable episodes in modern history. The systematic recruitment and migration of over 1 million people to all the corners of the globe. Indians are one of the most dispersed groups on this planet. And have you ever stopped to think why Indians are found in these far-flung places?
For hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, this was not just a voyage into the unknown. It was a life sentence.
When you take the system of coercion, the system of the lack of justice, the meagerness of people's existence, and the fact that they were just there to work, to make money for the planter class, then you can see why indentureship was called a new system of slavery.
By the 1830s, Britain's empire was growing at a phenomenal rate. Crops such as tea, coffee, cotton, and sugar had become staple products for an increasingly prosperous population. But the new and hungry machinery required an endless supply of raw material, and the furnaces of progress were fueled by slave labor. And while the empire was reaching its peak, it was also facing its greatest crisis. Liberals were demanding reform of the slave trade, beginning the process that would lead to the abolition of slavery.
Principles of justice, humanity, and sound policy.
In less than 5 years, Britain's plantation owners would lose their African slaves forever.
The British liked to preen themselves on the morality of this decision. That between 1833 and 1838, they end a system that they had in fact perfected and that had seen the shipping of millions of Africans across the Atlantic. For all kinds of complicated reasons, the British turned their back on that in the 1830s. Mainly economic, partly theological, partly political, but they turned their back on it. They decide they don't need it. But that leaves them with a problem, because the great economic system that they put in place on the back of slavery, and that is sugar, primarily sugar, though other commodities as well, had to be produced by someone. Indians seem to fit the bill. India might actually be a kind of replacement for Africa. India and Indians might actually provide an answer to the labour void that had opened up in the old slave colonies.
Whitehall's answer came in 1836. Publicly committed to spending millions dismantling the slave trade, the government secretly colluded in the creation of a new system of slavery. It was called indentured labour.
Indentured labour is a man or woman putting the mark on a document, a legal document, signing away their freedom to a particular employer for the duration specified by the indenture, 5, 7, 10 years, whatever. You're no longer a free man.
To trade in human lives so soon after the abolition of slavery required high-level contacts. But the man behind the plan was John Gladstone, a former Member of Parliament and father of the future British Prime Minister. He began by writing to one of his former colleagues in the slave trade.
You will probably be aware that we are very particularly situated with our Negro apprentices in the West Indies, and that it is a matter of doubt and uncertainty how far they may be induced to continue their services on the plantations after their apprenticeship expires in 1840.
In May 1836, Gladstone received the reply he was hoping for.
Dear Mr. Gladstone, we thank you for your inquiry. Within the last 2 years, upwards of 2,000 natives have been sent from this to the Mauritius. The Dangas are always spoken of as more akin to the monkey than the man. They have no religion, no education, and in their present state no wants beyond eating, drinking and sleeping, and to procure which they're willing to labour. We're not aware that any greater difficulty would present itself in sending men to the West Indies, the natives being perfectly ignorant of the place they agree to go to and the length of voyage they're undertaking.
Gladstone was delighted, and a deal was struck. The first ships left the port of Calcutta in April 1838, carrying a human cargo of some 400 Indians. They were called the Gladstone Coolies, after the Anglo-Indian word for manual labourer. These coolies would be making the longest journey of their lives, a voyage that would end on the sugar plantations of South America. In Gladstone's day, the remote colony of British Guiana produced the best sugar in the world, and the coastal plantations there had become a household name. Demerara.
My name is David Daberdeen. Even though the name means very little to me, I know very little about the name. I teach literature at a university in Britain, the University of Warwick, and I've come to Guyana to look for the origins of my great-great-grandfather, who came from India in the 19th century, one of hundreds of thousands of people who went overseas to cut cane in the plantations. He's been totally lost in history, and I just want to discover something about this bareback, barefooted coolie who stepped off the planks, stepped off the Englishman's boat, and ended up on these shores. I've been told that in our national archives there are various lists of Indians in the plantation, birth certificates, etc. So I will just go through those as diligently as I can to try to trace this man. It'll be a needle in a haystack job, I suspect. I was looking for the first Aberdeen who came in 1855, yeah. And I don't know the date, you see, so I was hoping to find the date. I know the name of the ship. My mother told me it was the Apolline. If I look at June 1855, would it be later than June 1855? You don't think this would be it?
No, our registers would have the details, but our ship records don't go back to 55.
Where are the records? Do they exist?
No, I don't think so. My best bet is at the PRO though.
In London?
Yes. And then they're scattered, in various offices as well.
So that even if the records did exist, we wouldn't really necessarily know what location in Guyana,
exactly.
Or indeed in England they exist.
Or even
In villages throughout India, the British kept meticulous records as the Indians were recruited, gathered into holding depots, and registered.
There would have been, in all likelihood, ordinary peasant Indians. They would never, ever, ever have come across the sophistication of the British Empire, the bureaucratic sophistication of it, until they went to the depot to be certified as fit and healthy emigrants and to be validated by the British as potential emigrants. Certified that we have examined and passed the above-named woman as fit to emigrate, that she is free from all bodily and mental disease, and that she has been vaccinated since engaging to emigrate. There must have been a great moment of drama when they were asked to sign this piece of paper and having to press their thumb into the ink and press it on this piece of paper. Their first contact with paper, probably. There must have been some kind of excitement, perhaps, despair, but at least somebody's paying attention to them. To take their finger and press it on a piece of paper. They would not have understood what pressing their thumbs on a piece of paper meant, because they wouldn't have known that that was the equivalent of a signature. This piece of paper is all that remains of the life of this woman. And she's one, there's hundreds in this book, banned book, hundreds, men, women, children. And this volume is one volume among 358, I believe, in this building alone. So you get a sense of how many Indians came. We know that about 239,000 people came from India to Guyana alone, never mind to Jamaica, to Barbados, the rest of the West Indies.
For a long time, the history of indenture was seen as the site of embarrassing history. People were reluctant to confront the truth of their past.
Historian Brij Lal is also investigating his family's past.
My grandfather was an indentured laborer. He came from the district of Bahraich. He was in his early 20s, and he told me that, he was roaming around in the village, and one day a man took him aside and said, "Would you like to earn some money?" And my grandfather, a young man without employment, said yes. And he took him to a depot. And there my grandfather encountered other men and some women who were also recruited by the same Arkati recruiter. And there he learned about going overseas. And you'd become a wealthy man. From this tiny depot in the village, he and other people who had been recruited were taken to Lucknow. And from there, they're taken to a larger depot in a district called Faizabad. And from there, he went to Calcutta. Like all of these people, he had no idea precisely where he was going. It was a tapu, an island, but that was about all that he knew. So he said, all right, I'll go to this tapu, and it's not too far away, and I'll come back after 5 years or 10 years. He didn't intend to leave his homeland for good. It was a traumatic experience to live in this confined spaces on the ships with people who spoke dialects they did not understand, people from different castes, religions, social background. And this terrible long voyage, the traumatic 3-month journey across the dark seas, the Kalapani, traumatized the people, many of whom had never seen water before.
Mortality aboard the Coolie ships was appalling. During the voyage of Juan, the Sol set, the captain's log recorded that over 1/3 of the Indians died en route.
March 26th, a little orphan girl, 4 years of age, died in a state of great emancipation. 3 coolies died. A man, a fine girl, 18, who attended the little orphan boy. A little boy of 12, 27th, a fine little baby, has died. This mortality is dreadful and without any means of being checked. A great reformation is required in the system of coolie emigration. May 2nd, one of the twins.
By 1840, over 20,000 Indians had made the long ocean crossing to South America. After a voyage of 3 months and some 9,500 miles, the Indians finally landed in Demerara.
The
this is where they arrived. They'll face this way and they're stepping ashore, so all this would have been land, it would have been fairly wild land, wouldn't it? Forests and
mangrove swamp.
But still the excitement of landing. But you know, they would have stepped back to have one last look. And when you look, you see nothing. The ocean just stretches endlessly. You can't see India.
Whatever the hazards of the journey, it must have been a moment of great excitement. These simple peasants, some of whom might have never seen water before, landing here, landing on a new continent. Curious spectators would have gathered to see these coolies, the first Indian coolies from the subcontinent. They would have been numbered in batches and properly regimented. They were deloused, they were made presentable for the inspection of the planters. Upstairs, they met labor officers, and downstairs, they met the immigration officers. So they came, they were cleaned up, they were given a bath, they were registered, they were contracted formally.
Having survived the long ocean voyage, their ordeal was only just beginning. These Indians didn't know it, but they would replace the African slaves that Britain had so recently lost. The vast majority would never see India again, and would end their lives working in cane fields on the other side of the world. Slavery had been renamed and reinvented.
It's an extraordinary phenomenon that you're shipping people out of Calcutta and shipping them all the way to the Americas to produce a commodity, sugar, which the West and anyone could do without perfectly well, but which, in fact, people have become completely addicted to. It's this great driving force of sugar and sweet taste in the Western world, which needs labour of some kind, slave labour, indentured labour, whatever, to produce it.
Whitehall, 1840. And Gladstone's experiment in South America began to be questioned as reports of appalling mortality on the plantations filtered back to London. The transportation of Indians was debated in Parliament, forcing the Foreign Secretary, Lord John Russell, to make his doubts public.
I am not prepared to encounter the responsibility of a measure which may lead to a dreadful loss of life on the one hand, or on the other to a new system of slavery.
But the influence of the planters on Parliament was too strong. Lord John Russell found himself outvoted, and the floodgates were opened. Over the next 80 years, Indians would be transported to every corner of the empire.
Planters had always had, throughout the 18th century, a powerful political hold in Westminster. The Caribbean became the great jewel in the British crown. I mean, this was the great centre of British wealth. I mean, India too, of course, but in terms of political power in London, planters, the plantocracy, the West India lobby that represented both planters and West India merchants and shippers, they could bend the ear of politicians and statesmen. It's in the planters' interest to continue indenture because they need the labour. Think of this from the planters' point of view. They live in their own particular culture where they need outside labour. First of all Africans, later indentured Indian labour. They're trapped by this system as much as other people. They can't imagine a world that would deny them a source of labour, cheap, malleable labour. Their whole economic enterprise would collapse without it. So the planters need to continue in the 19th century indentured labour, much as in the 18th century they couldn't have ever imagined life without the slaves.
India was now the empire's main source of cheap, expendable labour, and sugar production had spread to every corner of the globe. In 1874, the Fiji Islands became a crown colony. The planters turned to India to supply the manpower, and soon ships loaded with Indians began the long voyage to the South Pacific.
This is Fiji, picturesque and prosperous, contented and industrious. Tropical islands with a fascinating mixture of the old and the new. An outpost of empire at the crossroads of the Pacific.
When people think of Fiji, I suppose they think of a tropical paradise, but a paradise haunted by a terrible past. This is where our history begins. My grandfather came as an indentured laborer to this place, and this is where he served his indenture. So for about 3 generations, sugar has been in our blood.
Bridge Lal is visiting the family home in Fiji.
This is my place. This is the place of my childhood. We didn't have structures like this. We had thatched houses, and in fact it was in a thatched hut right here that I was born. This is where my grandfather's journey ended. I remember him telling me that the most difficult thing for him in the early days was getting used to living in congested lines and having as his companions people from different parts of India, different social backgrounds, different customs, different rituals and ceremonies, and sometimes even speaking different dialects.
The Coolies lived in tin shacks. They were called lines and built in long rows beside the plantation. A single room, 10 feet by 12 feet, housed 3 single men or 1 man and his entire family. Diseases including cholera, malaria and typhoid regularly wiped out hundreds of Indians at a time. Bridge is going to meet one of a handful of survivors.
Ram Ram. Ram Ram. आप बैठो कैसे तबीयत आपकी?
मेरी तबीयत बहुत अच्छा नहीं रही है।
क्या हुआ?
अरे काफी उम्र हो गया।
कितना उम्र है आपके?
अरे 100 बरस से ऊपर है।
100 बरस ऊपर ना?
हाँ, इंडिया के पैदाइश है।
अच्छा, अच्छा।
दिन में काम करो, संध्या का अपन नहाओ धो, बनाओ खाओ, सूतो। 3 बजे रात से उठो उठो उठो, घोड़ा कैस्टेबल में गरास जे वाला आदमी तो सवेर हो जाए, लाना फील्ड में जाए, फिर काम करके बनाओ खाओ, तो उठिए आदमी चटपट बनाओ खाए, उतना सवेरे भूख कहाँ लगे? रोटी बांध ले जाए हम खाए खेत में।
The Indians move into the old cabins, the old living places of the former slaves, or they're provided with similar in a similar location. I mean, one particular plantation that I know in the middle of Jamaica to this day has on the edge of its sugar fields an area called India, and it's where they located the first Indian indentured labourers.
Conditions worldwide were as poor as they had been in the slave days. In Guyana, David Daberdeen has managed to trace the very last surviving witness.
I'm going to see somebody who I've been told was born into that condition of servitude, was born into indentureship. An elderly lady, I think she's now in her 90s.
All
right. How are you?
Yes,
You were born in India?
Me born in India and grow Guyana. 3-year-old me company.
3?
3-year-old. Me never been done 3 years.
But your father worked in cutting cane?
Yes, my father been a cut cane, Guyana. Me and I'll been a bonkudi for no prel.
Doing what? Working in cane field?
Cane field here na, we roll the trash, I put them on the bank. You roll the trash, I put them on the bank, and you take a hole, you dig a dot, and leblam. The man take them and you wrap them and you go to load the pond. Me go go to the yard, we
What
go
for?
to the house.
To do what?
You go see now what take place in there.
Oh, you could just go in?
Go in.
As a child?
As a child.
And what you see? What you see?
Well, when you see the white man, you have to try to get away back to your house.
So you look at white man, you peep, and then you go back home.
Come back to your place.
And what white man doing when you peep? What was he doing?
Nah, he not do nothing.
As Indian men, women and children toiled in the fields, their colonial masters lived in the very height of luxury.
It is the closest to paradise that you can get, to be a planter. I mean, as a Hindu, I hope I come back as a 19th century planter. You lived in terrific affluence. You lived in a big white house, sometimes on a level above the cane field. So you can sit in your veranda and sip your lemonade and be fanned by a servant and have your toenails cut at the same time by some coolie, and you could watch at your laborers working. You know, you could sleep with any woman you wanted to, more or less, yes? Everything was done for you, from the time you woke up to the time you went to bed. People looked after you, people obeyed you, people were afraid of you. Your single word as a plantation owner could deny life.
The men that had once cracked the whip over the slave gangs heading for the slave fields now do much the same over Indian indentured labour, heading to do precisely the same work in the same fields, at the same regime, producing the same commodities for the same markets.
This is an overseer's house, a Columbus house, and as you can see, it is situated on a hill. And for a very good reason, because the overseer would get a very good view of the fields under his charge. And here the overseer would stand and survey the field and get a good view of the work that was being done. So he was in a commanding position.